Welcome to the Free Speech Center at Middle Tennessee State University. I'm Ken Paulson, the director of the program here, and I'm so pleased to have a special guest today, visiting campus, actually working with students, Corey Johnson. Corey, a real pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine. Thanks, Ken.
I have to confess, I know Corey in part because he got his first taste of journalism in many respects as a member of the Diversity Institute, a member of that class, which was sponsored by the Freedom Forum. I played a very small role, had the chance to talk with members, new students attending the Diversity Institute, but it was intended to encourage people who might not ever have considered journalism and who might actually come from a different cultural or racial background to make sure our newsrooms reflected society as a whole. Does that describe you when you walked in the door?
Yeah.
You were unlikely?
I was very unlikely. I had never gone to school for journalism. Prior to graduating from the DI, I had never even written a story before, let alone an internship or high school paper. None of that was in my background.
So, what in the world gave, having never written a story, what gave you the sense that maybe this is the right thing for me to do?
I was passionate about democracy, the community. We weren't that far off of 9/11, and that was a transformational period in my life. It made me want to get into journalism. It made me want to get out there and get into the news and cover news and translate news to people that I knew and cared about.
It's so extraordinary when you think about what you would have missed had you not entered journalism, and frankly, what the country would have missed. You've been a part of some incredibly important stories, and we want to talk about those. Just want to get on the record. If you had not gone into journalism, who would I be interviewing today? What would you be doing?
Oh man, that's a tough question to answer, because I almost said something that would have embarrassed my mom. I might have been working at Walmart. I probably might have been in a library or an archive or something of that nature, or something far worse. I mean, I tried substitute teaching for a little bit, and those kids brand me up out of there. So I don't really know what I'd be doing. I guess I'm like a lot of journalists where, you can't really imagine doing anything else.
That's right. Well, I'm sure you would have been good at it, whatever it was. And yet your journalism career has been incredibly impressive. What I find so remarkable about your career is how you almost immediately gravitated to investigative reporting. People who are not in the profession, nobody really walks in a newsroom as a green reporter and says, I'd like to be your investigative reporter. And they send you out the door, and you cover the police beat from 4 p.m. to midnight, that sort of thing. It's just, you earn your dues, you pay your dues, you learn the craft, but very early on, somebody saw in you this investigative zeal. And where did that happen?
So after I graduated from the Diversity Institute, they placed me in my first job, which was a small paper in Greenville, North Carolina. And even though I came in, balls of fire, wanted to become the next Woodward and Bernstein, they wanted me to go the traditional route, which is you work a beat. And so they put me on Night Cops, and I started doing police stories, taking papers to the police department and meeting people in the community. And the ideas and the tips started to grow from that. And I started to do, started to progress from your usual, turn of the screw police stories to stuff a lot more meatier on watchdog type stuff. And I won an investigative award for one of my stories, which was actually the first investigative award that paper had ever gotten. And that paper had been around since the 1800s. And that propelled me to my next job, which was still in North Carolina, but at a slightly bigger paper, who then gave me a little more freedom to do more watchdog work, and I started to just do, accountability stories on the university, accountability stories on the police, accountability stories and problems in the community. And then that ultimately got me noticed by an editor who was at Milwaukee. His name is Mark Catches, who, as fate would have it, is the executive editor of the Tampa Bay Times now. But Mark was at the Milwaukee paper. He had built the accountability team, and then he was being hired at the Center for Investigative Reporting. And so he encouraged me to apply. I applied. I didn't think I was going to get it. I got it. And then, so I ended up moving to California. And first day on the job, I get assigned to look into earthquakes and say, look, we want you to see if the schools are safe and prepared for the next earthquake. And 18 months later, we published a huge series that found that thousands and thousands of schools were not compliant with earthquake safety law.
And this was at the center?
It was at the Center for Investigative Reporting. And so that was the first story that had some kind of national implications and resonance, and it was my big break. But it was built on the back of doing traditional.
And how many years of experience did you have when you got that job?
Let's see. I think I had been in the business 5 years. 5 years.
To my earlier point, this is highly unusual career you have. So for those who may be watching, journalism students, others who are interested in the field, could you explain, it sounds like a simple question, what is it about the nature of investigative reporting that sets it apart from other acts of journalism?
So investigative reporting is very difficult. It's uncovering the news. It's finding information that people ultimately don't want you to know, and that is of importance to the public, or the public good, public interest. And so it bears some risk. There's a lot of risk involved with the work. And I'm not talking about risks of life or death, although, increasingly that's becoming a thing too. But there's risks to the paper, reputational risks, legal risks, risk of spending a lot of time and coming up dry and for naught. And so it's something that is prized in our field, in our industry, but you have to be very cautious and selective, and the people who do that work have to kind of be proven to do it. And in this era where we're cost cutting and the like, oftentimes your more experienced, skilled people are kind of getting pushed out the door for various economic reasons. And so we're seeing a loss of skills and a loss of investigative reporting as a result of it.
The point you made that is so important is you don't know if there's a payoff. There is suspicion among the general public that somebody sits down and says, I know what we'll report, but it's really, I know what we'll look into. And you could spend 2 months and go, it's not there.
Right.
We can't prove it, or there's nothing there to report. And that is the most frustrating thing of all about investigative reporting. Major investment in a time of diminished resources, but you have to have the courage and conviction to walk away and say, there's no story here. We're not going to force a story here.
Yeah, and you also, it helps that if you have a really good set of news, if you've been building sources, if you've been out in the community, then it helps when you have a reservoir of information and a reservoir of know-how, so you can make better choices up front around what a story idea could be potentially fruitful, what could not. Like if, I might personally believe that UFOs exist, but if you come out the woodwork and say, dig into a UFO sighting and kidnapping of my uncle, I'm probably going to pass up on that story, because I don't quite know if I'm going to be able to get the people from Planet Risk to talk on the record, right? And so you it takes a pragmatic but clear-eyed sense of what's out there, what's gettable, what you can do before you kind of launch onto one of those journeys, I think.
So when you write about children susceptible to earthquakes striking their schools, there's a very strong human element to everything you do. But then the Marshall Project is the ultimate human element in what you do. It's really about perhaps saving people's lives, but certainly getting them freed and seeing the justice is done. How did you get, first of all, if you could just tell viewers what the Marshall Project is all about and how you got involved.
So the Marshall Project was created from the vision of Neil Barsky, who had been a journalist with the Wall Street Journal and then moved into more entrepreneurial space. But he, over like a weekend, had been reading a Pulitzer Prize winning book called Devil in the Grove, which talked about essentially the rise of Thurgood Marshall and some of his work on some really heartbreaking cases of racial injustice. And Neil got inspired from reading that book and talking to folks that he just came to this burning sense that there was not enough news focus on the criminal justice system. So he created an organization that would just focus on nothing else but criminal justice related news and investigations to try to elevate that into the national consciousness. So I was part of a team that got hired for one of those jobs, and almost immediately myself and another reporter got an email about a young man who was now an adult and was in Angola prison in Louisiana, which is seen as one of the most notorious prisons, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But the unusual thing about this young man was he didn't have a criminal record before he was sentenced, and his crime was that he threw one punch in like a little neighborhood fight where a bunch of kids were wrestling and jostling and pushing each other around, and he hit a kid, and unfortunately the young man that he hit hit his head on a concrete curb and died. And the prosecutors went after him hard and he ultimately got sentenced to life without possibility of parole. And the timing, that email came to us at a time when the Supreme Court was looking at some of this, and there have been questions raised about the period of time on which this conviction was held. It was during a time when, in the 90s, when super predators, there was this big social commentary around urban crime and super predators that had gone all the way up to the White House. Well, Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and Joe Biden and others, even on the other side of the political spectrum, were all talking about these super predator youth that need to be locked away in order to create safety. And years had passed that showed that was junk science, and that was hysteria, but it wasn't rooted in fact and science. But yet you still had this legacy of all these young people who ended up in prison, and that was causing a burden on the prisons. And so there was a conversation that was being held around that. And we had been given this tip. And so I decided to look into it. And one of the things that I was able to do was I was able to talk to the prosecutor who actually prosecuted the young man and talk to the jurors. And what surprised me, none of these folks had ever talked before. And they all, even the prosecutors, were very remorseful looking back and felt like that they had made the wrong decision. In fact, the prosecutor said famously on the record, he's still a prosecutor, very famous, well-respected, tough prosecutor in that area. He said that if the Supreme Court of them had ever considered letting Taurus Buchanan, the young man, out, he would fall on his knees and thank God.
Wow.
And he said, I think I went too far, right? And some of the jurors said, I think Taurus was 16 when this happened, and the deceased kid was 12. And jurors said, at 16, he said, I have kids. At 16, we are not who we are meant to be.
Right.
And so we were able to get our arms around that story by going backwards and forwards. We were able to talk to Taurus a bit in the prison. And when that story published, the reaction was immediate and powerful. The New York Times wrote an editorial about it. Amnesty International put out a public petition. And Louisiana, even still being a very tough, crusty state when it comes to this, they ultimately decided to give Taurus Buchanan parole. And he got parole, and he's now in society, married, working. And so it just underscored for me, if I didn't know it, it just underscored then the power that journalism can have, the power that investigative journalism can have. It wasn't Watergate. It wasn't a Watergate type story, but it did reveal important things that were not in the public consciousness. And to that end, it ultimately affected change.
And the Marshall Project has continued to do good and important work, and made a difference in the lives of many, many people. And not just the prisoners, their families,
Yes,
their communities. Anyway, I greatly admire that work. And it also, what you just described, illustrates so beautifully that this was done. He was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. The system was not ever going to look at it again and was never going to fix it. And that's what people miss about a free press, is that they're the only agents, the only free agents out there that can do the kind of work you just described. Now, there are a lot of great groups, ACLU and others, who fight for people's rights, but there is a freedom to roam, a freedom to ask questions in American journalism that's extraordinary and powerful, and on my soapbox now, needs to be protected. Let's go to Tampa Bay, which is where you and your colleagues won the Pulitzer Prize for a package called Poisoned. Can you talk a little bit about the genesis for that story?
Yes. So when I got hired at Tampa, lead was on my mind. What we saw in those images out of Flint, Michigan, had really deeply affected me, because on my mother's side of the family, I was from Flint. She was born and raised in Flint. My grandparents and uncle and aunts and cousins all were Flint folks. So as a child, I would go visit Flint. I distinctly remember when I watched those images of the brown water in 2016 with the Flint crisis, it immediately took me back to my childhood, and remembering drinking that water and how awful it tasted even then. And in fact, my aunt, she was a manager at General Motors. She was the very first person I ever met that had her own water cooler in her house, and she was buying water in the 80s. And at that time, that was so rare that people clowned her. They said, "Oh, who she thinks she is? She got to buy water," And so when I saw those images, it took me back to my childhood, and it also made me very curious. And the more I started reading about lead and what lead could do, the more concerning it became to me. Like, okay, this is a poison, this is a toxin that's out here. And I saw when I got hired in Tampa, I asked to see if I could look into lead issues in Tampa, and I was given permission to do so. And I started asking the schools questions, and ultimately that resulted in discovering that the schools had a lead problem that they had never disclosed, that they had known about. And as those stories got published, and it provoked immediate outrage from parents and the communities, and made the schools do reforms, take out the bad water fountains and the sinks and do all of that. I got a call from a person, a confidential source in the health department, who met with me and gave me a report that straight up suggested and showed that the problem of lead was bigger than just the schools, that the county itself was leading the entire state of Florida in lead poisoning cases. There were thousands of folks that were getting poisoned with lead. And that was odd to me because I couldn't quite figure out why. And the report, in a vague kind of way, referred to an unnamed battery recycler. Didn't name the battery recycler, but said that a battery recycler was a key contributor. And so then that led us to try to find out what we could. And then that ultimately, we discovered that that lead factory was there in our own backyard. And that, and as we began to try to figure out how do we understand what's happening behind closed doors here, to figure out the deal, that's when we got pulled deeper and deeper into the space of what was happening. And I can remember the very first door I knocked on, I was asking the worker about lead and stuff in the air from an EPA report. And the worker said, I don't know anything about that. I just know about all the heart attacks and strokes folks are having over here. And he said, I just came back from a funeral of a guy, and I know he had high. Everybody knew his lead was high. And that not only blew our mind, but it also was the beginning of the odyssey for us. It's like something big is happening in our community, and we have to try to figure out what it is.
And in the end, is this a story of corruption, malfeasance, negligence, all three?
Yeah, more. It's a story. There's definitely corruption. There were people at the highest levels inside that company that knew about the problems, didn't take the steps to fix them. And when workers got sick, blamed the workers and punished the workers, even though they knew better. But it was also a story about government neglect, that the regulators had a powerful role to play that they weren't playing. And then there were some problematic decisions made in the 70s around lead that never got undone. And that made it to where people could have high levels of dangerous lead in their blood and yet look okay in the government's records because the metrics were set so poorly, and that politics was playing a role in getting those metrics fixed. So it was the combination of the company was doing bad things, but the government had enabled it. And so now you have people that were suffering as a result of it.
So tell me what happened because of your report.
The government came in, and several government agencies came in and did their own investigations and confirmed the findings of the stories and hit the company with fines and are forcing reforms as we speak. They're still forcing various reforms to ensure that this doesn't happen again. But the financial sector stepped in, the rating agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, which we know a lot of companies care deeply about how they're rated. They stepped in and they downgraded the company's credit to force them to also make changes. There is a conversation that some lawmakers have been having about looking at those metrics to improving them, to make changes so that the metrics could be safer for the nation's workers. There was the health department screened the kids in the community for lead, the kids who lived in that area around the plant. They went and tested them. The government changed the rules around how they collect data once we showed that the company had figured out and had schemed in such a way to fool the government. They changed their rules, and almost immediately after changing the rules, they found the company was in violation of air pollution. And lastly, there's been a range of lawsuits from one of the more famous police shooting attorneys, Benjamin Crump, he came down and signed up a bunch of workers and filed the first lawsuit. But then there's other lawyers and other law firms who have also filed lawsuits. The doctor who was at the center of looking the other way on a lot of these medical problems resigned and retired and closed down his clinic, and on and on. So there's been a range of various impacts that happen as a result of the story.
The power of the press.
Power of the press.
I have one more question for you. You are currently with ProPublica, a public interest organization that has given a great boost to American journalism. What is the future of investigative reporting in an era in which there are so many cuts in journalism? How can we keep investigative reporting alive?
Well, right now, I think that the biggest challenge is figuring out the funding model. ProPublica is nonprofit, and it's not traditionally based, where it's not burning up a bunch of trees to put a paper on someone's desk. The future may look more like that, with more news organizations going digital, maybe even change the nonprofit spaces, who knows? But the future is, investigative reporting is never going to go away, because humanity is such where there's always going to be some ornery, question-raising type folk who will be determined to try to get at the truth, no matter who against it, right? So there's always going to be that form. There is a problematic, heartbreaking question about the folding up of local news and the folding up of local news organizations that have served America well for decades, and now they're disappearing. And I don't know the answer. I don't know everybody have the full answer to that, but I know there's a conversation that's being had about national organizations who are far more resourced at this time, doing more to help local communities, maybe even sponsoring and doing more things with journalists at the local level to make sure things don't die. There's a big conversation around that ProPublica is playing a part in as others. So that's a long-winded way to say it's not quite clear, but investigative reporting is never going to die. But we certainly need more of it, especially now because of the changes in America, the politics and the such.
We'll get the quality journalism we're willing to pay for. And I hope Americans will invest.
Yeah, we hope.
Well, congratulations, Corey, on a remarkable career. And there's so many years of ornery work still to be done. I've heard journalists describe it in many ways. Courageous, reckless, you name it. Ornery is a good description. It suggests a passion.
Look, when you're in my seat, everybody and their mama is telling you no, 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 no. So you have to learn how to push through that if you want to get this information out to the American people.
Corey Johnson, congratulations on your rich career.